Today on Sports Central, we go over our 2022 college football predictions for the Kansas Jayhawks, team that went 2-10 overall in the 2021 season. For how this team be in 2022 and whether or not Kansas will be improved in the 2022 season is what we go over here today. We'll be analyzing this team and predict their schedule game by game in this video. Starting out with their team trends, Kansas 2-10 last season. They were 1-5 in their first 6 games, 1-5 in their last 6 as well. So finished out at 2-10. And just another challenging season for Kansas. This is a team that hasn't been a relevant contender since 2007. I mean, that was the one, obviously, the big standout season for Kansas when this team was actually very relevant nationally. But since then, this team has just been a very poor football team. And so, I mean, looking at 2022 here, obviously Kansas is a team that, I mean, it's tough to predict that this team is going to be good. But obviously we can look at the return in production and kind of try to determine whether or not this team could maybe surprise some people this season. But looking at 2021, this team, they beat South Dakota 17-14. I mean, that was, a very close win considering South Dakota is an FCS team. That's a team that most FBS opponents would beat by quite a bit, but in the end, a win's a win for this team. Lost to Baylor 7-45. They lost to Coastal Carolina as well the week before by a significant margin. They lost to Oklahoma 23-35. Obviously, that was a very interesting game there. Kansas, I still remember, Kansas being up for a long time against OU, being a team that was so hyped up going into the season, and Kansas was beating them, I think, heading into the fourth quarter. But in the end, the Sooners kind of took off and got the win there by 12, even though Kansas could have pulled off the upset of the century there. Lost Oklahoma State the next week 3-55. They beat Texas 57-56. Still a very memorable, just a huge win for Kansas going on the road, beating Texas in overtime in just an insane score 57-56. But they did lose to West Virginia to finish out the season 20-34. Even though, this team, they did keep it very close against TCU and West Virginia in those last 2 games. They lost to TCU on the road by 3 the week after they beat Texas, and they lost to West Virginia by 6 there to finish out the season. So this team, they weren't terrible in those last 3 games, and that's something you got to look for as you predict the season, is how did this team finish out, and whether or not they got a decent amount of momentum going into the next season. And I'd say this team does. They performed, I'd say, pretty well, and they improved over the course of the season. So Kansas, I wouldn't say is, obviously a team that's going to be too relevant in the Big 12, but I think it'd be good if this team can take a step in the right direction, get above 3 wins, potentially inch their way towards 6 and maybe even a bowl game. But your roster going to next season, now you do return your top quarterbacks in Jalen Daniels and Jason Bean going into next season. Both quarterbacks split time, and Jason Bean was the primary starting, and he played the most, as he passed 181 times versus Daniels with 117. Bean's stats, 1,200 yards, 6 touchdowns, 6 picks, 56% completion rate, and Daniels right around 70% completion rate, along with 860 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 3 picks. So, statistically, you could say Jalen Daniels was the better quarterback next season, or last season he was. And, obviously, Jason Bean ended up getting a little more playing time. And so, but it looks like Jalen Daniels is the projected starting quarterback going into the 2022 season. So keep an eye on him to at least start the season for now at the quarterback position. The backfield, Devin Neal is coming back. You do lose your second running back there in Pasek Hickson. So the backfield, you lose one there, but it does, it's huge that you got Devin Neal coming back, who does show some potential. He put up 800 yards, 9 touchdowns last year, so that's definitely a great return. Jason Bean also rushed for 400 yards and 2 touchdowns, something to keep an eye on there as well. Receiving core, Kwame Lassiter II, you do lose him, who was your top receiver from last season, 650 yards, 3 touchdowns. But the good thing is you return your second, third, and fourth receivers there, and Trevor Wilson, Luke Grimm, and Lawrence Arnold. So I'd say the receiving core looks pretty good. The backfield looks good. The quarterback situation looks okay as well. This is a Kansas team that shows some potential going to next season here. You lose 2 on the offensive line. Defensively, you lose 1 on the D-line, 1 linebacker, and 2 in the secondary. So you lose 4 starters. from defense, which is fairly typical. I mean, that's not very much out of the ordinary for any team. I mean, every team is going to lose a couple players. So, I mean, returning production, I'd say looks good for Kansas. Brings up the question, how high is the ceiling for the Jayhawks going into next season? I would say, I mean, this is a team that does have, I mean, they don't have the easiest schedule, even though, I mean, it's manageable. I mean, most teams could handle it pretty easily, but obviously it's still, I mean, for a Kansas team that has barely gotten above 3 wins in the past 10 years, I mean, it's a challenge. But I'd say the ceiling is probably 5-6 wins for this team going into next season. I do think Kansas is a team that, I mean, if things come together, they got the return of production to do it. They got the experience to do it. I mean, this is a team that could make a run for 6 wins next season, potentially, if they gain some momentum and win some of the games that I think are, once again, pretty winnable for this team. We'll get into that in a second here. But your transfer portal and recruiting going into next season, Marvin Grant, safety, he's coming in from Purdue. You lose Deuce Mayberry, defensive back, to Louisiana Monroe. You bring in multiple players here. You got Douglas Emilian coming in from Minnesota, wide receiver. McCaskill, linebacker, coming in from Louisiana. Jarrett Paul, safety from Eastern Michigan. Kai Thomas, running back from Minnesota. And you got Lonnie Phelps, an edge rusher, coming in from Miami, Ohio. And Craig Young, safety from Ohio State. So the transfer portal actually has been pretty good for this team, you could say, as they've got multiple players that could start right away in the season. Recruiting-wise, 117th in the nation, so very terrible if you're looking at recruiting. And they're dead last in the Big 12. I mean, 117th, that is the lowest, you could say, in the Power 5 for Kansas here, by a decent margin. I mean, this team just has not gotten it done in recruiting, but at least the transfer portal, this team has brought in a few players that could be potential starters. You got 8 3-stars, but no 4-stars or 5-stars coming in. But I mean, once again, the transfer portal, that's, I think, what this team is kind of focused on, because I mean, this team is set to win some games this upcoming season. So the recruiting, I don't think, was much of a focus for this team. They kind of focused on landing players in the transfer portal, which very well could be a smart move for this team. But that said, so your schedule now going into next season, you got Tennessee Tech in week 1, and that is a very winnable matchup there. Then you got West Virginia on the road, Houston on the road. So I mean, your non-conference games, I mean, turns out Houston is looking like a pretty good football team right now. Duke is a Power 5 opponent, even though one of the worst in the Power 5. And of course, Tennessee Tech, very winnable game there. So I mean, it's a challenging schedule. I mean, going on the road there in your week 2 and 3 matchups, I mean, it's a challenge. It's manageable. I don't think it's, I mean, out of the question that this team could get to a bowl game. But obviously, those first 4 games, it's going to be crucial that you get at least a couple of wins in there. Then you got Iowa State at home, TCU at home, Oklahoma on the road, Baylor on the road, Oklahoma State to start off in November at home, then Texas Tech on the road, Texas at home, and then Kansas State on the road to finish out your season. So looking at September, Tennessee Tech, would say that's an easy win there, so you take care of them. And then you got West Virginia and Houston. I do think you lose both those games, even though you put up a fight against Houston there. I don't think Houston's going to be quite as good in 2022. I mean, they were actually a very good football team last season. Well, actually, I do think Houston, I mean, looking at their talent, I do think maybe Houston could, I mean, they could be better for all we know. I'm just going to say they'll be in the same ballpark as last season. So, I mean, it's a good team. You put up a fight, but you take a loss in the end. And then you got Duke, close win, but you take care of them. So you're 2-2 heading into October. You got Iowa State, TCU, Oklahoma, and Baylor. I will say this, Iowa State and TCU, both extremely winnable games there. You got them both at home. Iowa State's in a rebuild phase. TCU just got rid of their head coach, Gary Patterson, he's been the coach there for many, many years. And so they're kind of back in a rebuild phase. Both those games are very winnable, but in the end, I do want to say you beat TCU, but you lose to Iowa State. So, I mean, Iowa State, it's a winnable game once again, but I do think Iowa State goes in and sneaks out a win by a few points. And then TCU, winnable matchup once again. You get the win there, so you do beat TCU. I do think that's a game. You got them at home. I do think that's a game that's winnable for this team, and you put up a fight, you get the win there. So a nice win there. Then you got 2 road games to Oklahoma and to Baylor. Both are pretty challenging matchups, so I think you end up losing both of those. So you're 3-5 heading into November. As for November, Texas Tech is a winnable game. Texas, you could say, I mean, because Kansas beat Texas on the road last season. But then again, I do think the Longhorns are a much better team in 2022 versus 2021. K-State's going to be tough. Oklahoma State's going to be tough. So it's a challenging month, and in the end, I do think you end up losing these 4 games. Texas Tech is easily the most winnable out of the 4. Going on the road there could happen, but I do think in the end, Texas Tech pulls out a close win, and you also lose to Oklahoma State, Texas, and Kansas State, I do think, in the end. So 3-9 is the record for Kansas. I mean, another disappointing season ahead, I do think, for Kansas, even though I guess 3 wins is better than 2 if you want to look at it that way. But I mean, Kansas talent-wise, once again, I mentioned this before, they got the talent, they got the potential here, landing those players in the transfer portal as well to potentially make a run at 6, or at least get 4 to 5. But in the end, the schedule is fairly difficult for a Kansas team that has struggled so much in recent history. I mean, Houston, and it's also a tough break. I mean, Houston, turns out they're a good football team right now. I mean, they've been pretty beatable for many years, but turns out last season they were pretty good, and they should be good again in 2022. I mean, Duke, a Power 5 opponent, and of course the Big 12 schedule, going on the road to Oklahoma and to Baylor and to West Virginia and K-State even. I mean, it's a challenging schedule, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below on the Jayhawks, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.